Our guest today is historian, philosopher Yuri Felshtinsky. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for coming. I would like to start with Trotsky because you are considered one of the world-leading experts in Trotsky's life. Yes, it's true, but it happened incidentally. I immigrated to the United States in 1978 and I settled in Boston. Harvard University is in Boston. And in Harvard University, they have the archive of Trotsky, who sold it to Harvard University right before his death. That just happened so. And being a historian, I went to that archive and I spent some years in that archive. And yes, probably I became the main expert in Trotsky's life, and I published many works of Trotsky, like first publications. I wrote a 4-volume biography of Trotsky. So yes, Trotsky makes a considerable share of my historical research. But I worked on not only on Trotsky, but I worked on the Russian Revolution and Stalin and Lenin and some other political figures. Could everything have gone differently if Trotsky had managed to outplay Stalin? See, in this political race, Trotsky couldn't outplay Stalin. And I think it's a philosophical issue. Trotsky believed in revolution, but he didn't believe in bureaucracy and in the party's administration. He didn't believe in intrigues. That's why he couldn't outplay Stalin. As I describe it in the book that's been released now in Latvia, and that's the reason why I came here to present the book. Actually, it's for the first time for many, many years. The last time I was in Latvia in 1973. So the book describes the history of the Russian Revolution through the lens of the battle of the security services for the power. And in this battle, Trotsky turned out to be an outsider. And it's not surprising that he lost the power. And he lost the power right away. As soon as Lenin was killed, Trotsky was sent abroad, then he lived in exile there, and finally he was killed. And when you study Trotsky's life, you see that it was inevitable. Trotsky had no chance to win in the battle with Stalin. Maybe Dzerzhinsky, the head of VChK, had this chance because the idea to assassinate Lenin was Dzerzhinsky's and Stalin's. And Dzerzhinsky hoped to outplay Stalin, but Stalin outplayed Dzerzhinsky, and as a result Dzerzhinsky was killed. And all the following events, and if we take into account the fact that Dzerzhinsky was killed, and there are facts that actually support this version, and all the following events and all the heads of the security agencies, and those security agencies changed their names, all those heads of the agencies were killed. And in fact, this battle between the state security agency and the Communist Party was constant and very bloody. During Stalin's time, they killed approximately 35,000 high-ranked officers of the state security agency. And when in 1991, in August, we thought that Soviet Union collapsed with such an ease and the democratic revolution won, later it was clear that the democratic revolution didn't win, and one of the reasons of that was that the state security agency was playing against the Soviet Union and against the Russian democracy and managed to win in this battle, and we saw it in 2000. But see, the formation of the Soviet system of state security agencies and this power source, and Trotsky was the creator of the Red Army, and it's also like a power source. And after the secret police of the Tsar, they had this superpower, this KGB, VChK, MGB, VChK, and NKVD. So it turns out it's very enduring, viable, and it becomes like an entity within the system. Well, see, I never visited those offices of that agency, but as I understand and see from the television footage, on the walls they have three portraits of Dzerzhinsky, Andropov, and Putin. And it's clear why Dzerzhinsky, he was the first head of the State Security Agency, and it was created in 1917, and it was called VChK. And his mission was to take over the power. And Andropov, the second one, he was the first head of KGB, the chairman of KGB, who first became the Secretary General of the party, and then he became the chairman of the Supreme Council of the USSR. So he was the first head of the State Security Agency who for real became the head of the state. Very soon he died, though. He was in power only for 1.5 years. And Putin, as a man who finally realized, accomplished the mission that Dzerzhinsky was the originator of in 1918. So, the Communist Party, as we know, had a chance to resist the State Security Agency. On the one hand, the Communist Party needed the State Security Agency. They actually called it the armed unit of the party. But on the other hand, it was a very serious opponent, because every time when the State Security Agency took the initiative, it began to kill the bureaucrats from the party. And so that was swinging back and forth till 1956. The last shooting of the state security officers were in 1956, and then the rules of the game changed, and they kind of made an agreement, I don't know, formally or informally, that they're not going to kill each other anymore. But from the point of view of KGB, the Soviet Union lost the battle for the world revolution because of the weakness of the Communist Party, because the Communist Party kind of limited itself with this leftist dogmas, and it couldn't properly fight against the global imperialism. And comparing with the Third International of Lenin, that united the leftist forces to fight the Western democracy, and the Fifth International of Putin, because the Fourth International was created by Trotsky, by the way. So the Fifth International of Putin kind of united all forces that are ready to fight against the Western democracy. In some cases, we can see that Putin relies on the leftist, on the right wing, in some cases on the Greens. He doesn't care. For him, it's important that these are the forces that will be undermining the Western democracy. Therefore, fighting against the forces of the Fifth International is more complicated, because it was pretty easy and clear with communists. Black and white world, Communist Party is the enemy, the Communist Party is undermining democracy across the world. So everybody took on this concept, and things seemed to be pretty clear and easy until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. But now it is very difficult to understand and explain what's happening, because the West has been always uncoordinated. And the Western democratic world was always like that. And some obscure forces have been trying to undermine it. But now it's obvious the core of these forces in Europe is Russia. Back to Stalin. Is Stalin an inevitable thing of the Soviet regime? Was he supposed to appear? What is his phenomenon about? He wasn't some outstanding member of the party. He wasn't a well-educated man, yet he graduated from a seminary and he wrote poetry, actually. But it seemed that he managed to outplay everyone, and he became a figure that kind of personifies the Soviet Union, and everything that was after him was kind of going down the hill. So what do you think? See remarkable political figures, and let's define them as Lenin, Trotsky, Dzerzhinsky, and Stalin. They were relying on different institutions in order to consolidate their power. Lenin was relying on the Council of People's Commissars, and the Soviet Russia at the initial stage was run by the Council of the People's Commissars. And after the death of Lenin, and I need to emphasize that Lenin was removed, Lenin was assassinated. He didn't die his own death. And after Lenin's death, Dzerzhinsky was planning to take over the power, relying on the Council of Agriculture. And everybody forgot about this body. This is the Supreme Council of the Agriculture. And Dzerzhinsky was planning to run the Soviet Union through VChK, that council. And Trotsky, as you properly mentioned, Trotsky was running the army, but that's actually why the army never became a political power in Soviet Russia and then in Russia in modern days. And because Trotsky was the head of the army and they had concerns that Trotsky might want to use the army to consolidate his power, army, in a political sense, was weakened significantly, and after the purge of 1930s, he was completely destroyed as a separate agency and structure. So Stalin decided to consolidate his power through the Central Committee of the party, but formally speaking, the Central Committee of the party had nothing to do with ruling the country. And as Avtarkhanov, a very interesting and very important historian, as he wrote, Stalin could run the country through any structure or any governmental body. But the point was not through what body you do this, but who will win in this battle. And yes, of course, Stalin was a mediocre political figure and not a great personality, but Putin also in KGB had a pretty interesting status, and they give people nicknames in KGB, and they're very accurate, and Putin's nickname was a moth, yeah, like grayish, unnoticeable, and see, this moth in 2000 became the president, and it turned out forever. Do you think now Putin uses Stalin as his role model? I think that it would be better to say that it's not he's using Stalin. Of course he probably wanted to use Stalin, maybe he will, but I think that Putin has two characters, two heroes that he is trying to imitate. And he's trying to take the best, quote-unquote, from them. This is Hitler and Stalin. And this is where Putin's quirks come from. when all of a sudden he makes up a new history of World War II, and he blames the Poles that they are to blame for the beginning of World War II because they refused to give up Danzig to Hitler. And that's quite a turn, a new concept. But he so much sympathizes with Hitler that he doesn't even understand how wild it sounds. Forget about history at all. And the same with Stalin. Stalin, of course, is a benchmark for him, political figure who managed to conquer half of Europe. And naturally, this is what Putin is trying to achieve when he's trying to restore the Soviet Union. And as he said in March of 2022, and he thought that Ukraine is already done and he'll move on, he's trying to restore the influence the Soviet Union had. And of course, maximum of that influence was during Stalin's time. So therefore, for Putin, Stalin is a hero. And now we can see the attempts to revive the cult of Stalin's personality. But on the other hand, we can see quite a rise of classical fascism in the Russian Federation. And again, in those cases where the Soviet government relied only on the left-wing forces, Putin is trying to unite all forces that fight against Western democracy. In this sense, Nazism, fascism, and communism actually found each other together within the period of 1939-1941. Well, in this sense, let's look at this story. Putin now, and forgive my wording, Putin is kind of more honest. He doesn't make up a myth about the Soviet Union that was fighting Nazism. He just starts with the history that started on the 22nd of June 1941. It was like a Soviet historical propaganda. So he kind of counts history from that point. But since 1939, General Krivoshein and the Pact of Molotov and Ribbentrop, he's not talking about this. And in 1982, he actually published the history of the Treaty of Molotov-Ribbentrop, and you spoke about those secret protocols. Yes, right, it was the first publication in Russian. Yes, it was back in the Soviet days, right, but you need to keep in mind that I published it in the United States, where I lived by then. But in 1989, the first publication of the book was in Vilnius. It was the first Soviet publication. But that's the point. Let's put it like this. If Hitler hadn't attacked Stalin, Stalin wouldn't have had to formulate an anti-Nazi concept. But since Germany was an attacking party, and that's why Stalin had to rewrite the whole history. Since 1939 to 1941, of course, this history was completely different, and Soviet Union was a real ally of Hitler's Germany, and the Soviet Union supported Hitler's Germany with military equipment while Germans were fighting the UK. And the Soviets had the warmest diplomatic relationship before the 1939 the Soviet Union had with the fascist Italy. So therefore, the resemblance and similarities of communist concept and fascist concept were quite obvious even before 1941. And before 1939. And again, it's not incidental that Soviet-German relationship that started in 1918, it was easier to build them than the relationship of the Soviet Union with other democratic countries, because based on not accepting The Treaty of Versailles, that was the foundation of partnership relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union, starting in 1918. In March of 1918, they made the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which allowed Germany to continue the war against the allies, the United States and France. Well, it seems that this is sort of a subconscious thing, right? On the one hand, Putin declares the beginning of the war, as he called it, a special military operation to denazify Ukraine, but on the other hand, he's walking the steps of Adolf Hitler, and when he's blaming Ukraine. Well, actually, Putin has this tendency to attribute his own intentions to the victim. As you remember, in 2007, in his Munich speech, as they say, that was the beginning of a new aggressive policy of the Russian Federation. Putin said that in comparison to the United States, that is trying to create a unipolar world, and Russia is trying to make a multipolar world. It's 2007. In fact, it's the other way around. In fact, the United States, after the First World War and Second World War, the United States were producing 50% of global GDP. And in fact, they were overweighing the rest of the world. But nevertheless, the United States actually created the multipolar system, where we had socialist countries, democratic countries, and fascist countries. The US never had the idea to create a new order where the United States would be the leader and the only leader. So Putin was trying to create, and still is trying to create, a unipolar world. He's trying to control everything in Europe and Russia. In Asia, everything is controlled by China. So that's the goal. And again, it has a lot in common with the theory of the global revolution of the Bolsheviks. And in fact, Dzerzhinsky was an ardent supporter of this theory. The one who created the first VChK, the first secret service of the Bolsheviks. And this revolution implied that the whole world will be communist world. And it seemed that the theory was utopian, and it seemed that the whole world didn't become communist. But in fact, in quite a serious share, the world became communist. By 1945, Europe was under the Soviet Union. In 1949, the revolution won in China. Then we've seen some socialistic and communist enclave around the world. Obviously, this theory of the global revolution wasn't realized, but it managed to beat up the democratic world quite a bit. So that's why Putin secretly is continuing doing what that global revolution used to be doing. He is just, based on the experience of the loss of the Soviet government in the Cold War, caused by Americans creating the nuclear weapons, and they had this concept of peaceful coexistence, he realized that there were wimps in the Kremlin. So that's the vision of the secret services, secret agency, KGB. So and those wimps were not ready to continue the fight. That's why Putin, and you probably remember, at some point after the beginning of the war of 2014, Putin said, that the Soviet Union sort of came about to a new understanding of nuclear confrontation, that Russia can actually win in a nuclear war. And that was quite a new statement, because the Soviet government, in fact, thought that it was impossible to win in a nuclear war. And again, that view that it's possible to win a nuclear war, that was his attempt to formulate an excuse why the war against the Western world should be continued until the victory. And what that victory will be about, let's not guess. But when Putin began to understand that, because he's coming to the power, and then explosions of the apartment buildings in Moscow, and the book you wrote, many people thought that it was a conspiracy theory book, and people don't actually open their eyes right away, so to speak. And many things changed in perception of the tragedy after the beginning of the big war in Ukraine, as if somebody actually opened their eyes. And back then, many people from the opposition didn't agree with you that those apartment buildings were blown up by FSB. And when did Putin become who he is now? Well, see, in 2000, he came in power as a representative of KGB. He is the first among the peers. Remember, on the 20th of December of 1991, he'll become the acting president 11 days later, but back then nobody knew it. The 20th of December was the anniversary of foundation of VChK, and Putin spoke at a semi-public meeting of the heads of KGB, FSB back then. And there was no television, nobody was officially recording it, but obviously somebody had a camera and recorded his remarks. And he said the following: the group of KGB officers that was sent to work undercover in the government is succeeding at the first stage of its mission. So in fact, this work undercover, this is what all officers of security services did when, after working in Lubyanka building, in the main building of KGB, they were sent in different regions of Russia and abroad. First of all, Putin worked abroad as the director of the Society of Soviet-German Friendship in Dresden. Then he worked undercover in St. Petersburg town hall as assistant to the mayor, Sobchak. Then he worked in the Kremlin. Then he became the director of FSB. So he was guided, in comparison to Lenin and Stalin, who were fighting for the power, who did time in prison. So Putin didn't fight for anything, he didn't risk anything, he was just being promoted. And then finally he got promoted to the position of the president. This is 2000. And of course, after that, as any person on the position, especially when this position was given to him, he begins to consolidate the power. And I think that this period ended when he came back in power after Dmitry Medvedev. And that's why we see a different Putin. In 2014, he is the Putin who is ready to wage a war, literally, to start a war with the democratic countries. But I think there is a very interesting observation. At some point, when Putin was making another documentary about himself, I think it's better to put it this way, he told us who made a decision of the war of 2014. In fact, the film was made after 2022. But he told us in the documentary who actually made the decision to start the war in 2014 and then in 2022. So this decision was made by 5 people, both in 2014 and in 2022. It was Putin, Patrushev, Bortnikov, Shoigu, and Gerasimov. Shoigu and Gerasimov, they were more like technical workers. So in fact, the decision to invade in 2014 and 2022, there were 3 people made this decision. High-ranking officers, Putin, Patrushev, and Bortnikov. And that's to answer your question, who is running Russia and who is making important decisions, because these are the most important political decisions. It's not the cabinet, it's not the Russian Duma, it's not the Council of Federations, and it's not the Security Council. These are 3 top officers of FSB. And over time, Putin became the person that probably overweighs a block of some leaders from FSB. Well, first of all, the administration of the president became stronger. If before they thought that the main driving force was FSB, so now they have presidential administration as a separate institution, which is also in many ways formed by FSB officers. But it's a different thing how they compete with each other, who is stronger. Probably we'll get an answer to this question only if in Russia something happens, something like a coup. But if it doesn't happen, then we'll never learn what's actually going on there. But the fact that Russia is run by the State Security Agency, that's true. Russia is the only country where State Security Agency is running the country and where they don't have parties that are actually fighting for the power, and the political field is completely leveled and there is no opposition. I think it's obvious. So this started when? So Putin made this decision back in 1999, in 2000. The Second Chechen War was also the war for him to win. Yes, the First Chechen War and the Second Chechen War both are FSB's wars. The First Chechen War and the second one were started to have an argument if they need to cancel the election if their desired candidate doesn't win the election. In 1994, when the First Chechen War began, it was preparation for the election of 1996. If you remember, in the presidential campaign of 1996, Yeltsin signed the decree or to postpone or to cancel the election results. So the decree wasn't declared, but it was prepared, and according to this decree, Yeltsin would have become an illegitimate president, and they will slowly and gradually send him to exile. He'll resign. And actually, it happened in 1999. Yeltsin left the post, and Putin became the president. But back then, the person who would have been the new president was Mr. Saskovets. So, in order to cancel or postpone the election, they needed a Chechen war. They needed an excuse. And the same they planned in 1999, just in case. Because who could have known? What if Putin is unelectable? What if they'll have to cancel or postpone the election? why to invent the bicycle? So they already had this experiment with the first Chechen war. So let's start the second one for the same reason. So this is what exactly happened. The second Chechen war started right before the election, just in case if Putin will be unelectable, and they would have to postpone the election. For those people, and I understand their logic, who don't believe in the version that the apartment buildings were blown up by FSB. But, well, first of all, even according to the version of FSB, and forget about what I wrote together with Litvinenko. So let's say, according to FSB, officially, there was no one Chechen that was involved in the explosions. There were people from Karacháyevo-Cherkessia Republic and other ones, but none of Chechens was involved in the explosions. But the war was started against the Chechen Republic. And the second fact is, this is the date of the beginning of the Second War. The war started on the 23rd of September, in the minutes, not even in the hours, but in the minutes, when in Ryazan they arrested FSB officers who planted explosives in the basements of the Ryazan apartment building. So they planted them on the morning of 23rd of September, and the whole Russia was already going nuts because they knew about the explosions in Moscow, and as soon as those two officers were arrested and they showed their IDs that they work for the central office of FSB, and it became clear that journalists and press was back then free, and the press would be able to compare the explosions of the Moscow buildings with the Ryazan story, and they will be late to start the war. In that minute, they actually started the war, and they started the war to overshadow what was happening with those explosives in Ryazan. Since then, many years passed, but there are no new facts that Chechens were actually involved in those explosions. Recently, Catherine Belton was interviewed by Olesya Batsman, Ukrainian journalist. Completely different topic. And just by the way, she said, when she was talking about the sources of her information, and when she was asked how she gets her information, she said, you know, I had a source who told me that Patrushev, in his close circle among friends, that he said that the September explosions were organized by him. Just kind of by the way. And you know, after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I think everybody realized that those people could blow up the buildings in Moscow. Because, you see, the price, the award was quite big. As a result of this, they got the whole Russia. And in comparison to KGB, that was a powerful agency with the biggest budget, and General Kalugin said to me that the Soviet Secret Service was the biggest secret service in the world with the biggest budget. But nevertheless, that agency, the secret agency, was under control of the Communist Party. The party was bad, but nevertheless, they were under the control of the Communist Party, and they were getting the budget that they were receiving from the Ministry of Finance. But today, FSB is ruling Russia without any control. And instead of the budget, they have all resources of Russia. And these people were never taught how to build. They don't know how to do that. They were taught how to destroy, to kill, to recruit, to take under control. This is what they can do well, and we can see the result of their work. 2008, Georgia; 2014, Ukraine, Crimea; 2022, Ukraine and other wars, hybrid wars, drones. These are the results of their work. This is their element. That's the only thing that they know how to do. They're not cut for anything else. That's why there is the end of it looming anywhere near us. But when they decided to resume this mechanism of political assassinations, Litvinenko case, Shekachyhin, what happened to Artyom Borovik, was it a plane crash or it was a setup, Nemtsov assassination, and many others. Well, see, we are talking historically about the country where terror was bloody and millions of people died. Tens of millions of people died during the Soviet time as a result of some sort of terror. There was revolution, industrialization, collectivization, famine in Ukraine, the losses in World War II that nobody counted. And all that happened in a closed-up regime when the borders of the Soviet Union were closed. And Putin, who, against this backdrop, looks, I'd say, quite liberal, a pro-Russia politician, because the borders are open. They use assassinations quite rarely. In what cases? And I think there are several categories that they consider. If a particular political figure competes with Putin for the power in the Kremlin. And of course, this is Nemtsov's case, this is Navalny's case. If other figures, they betray, in Putin's opinion, if they betray Putin, then of course that's the case of Litvinenko. And that's why many big businessmen and oligarchs, they're very much afraid of getting under this category, the category of traitors, because we don't really know how Berezovsky died. Those who heard about it know that he hanged himself. But if he was killed exactly because, according to Putin, he betrayed him. Because Berezovsky was a part of Putin's entourage, and together they were taking over Russia. And then Berezovsky betrayed Putin. And the third category, this is big money, when the money is very big. But one way or another, the Russian leadership relies on assassinations very rarely. And that's the key difference from the Stalin system. And again, I emphasize that everything that's happening, it's with open borders and without the capital punishment. My explanation of such a liberalism of the system, particularly Russian leadership not to introduce the capital punishment, but in fact they can do it even tomorrow if they want to. So I think it has to do more with the historical memory, because the State Security Agency knows how many people it lost when in Soviet Union they had the capital punishment in Stalin's period and up to 1956. So I think this historical memory kind of keeps them from introducing the capital punishment, because they know that with a great probability they will be the first to be shot. Yagoda, Yezhov, Abakumov, these high-ranking officers, this is in their memory, right? How those were killed. Yes, I think that's the only thing that stops them from introducing the capital punishment in Russia. Do you think the fear of repression is actually substantiated? Is Putin ready to start repressions within the FSB of 21st century? I think that it's not going to happen. I think their system is built on the premise that they're unsinkable, that nothing can be done to them, they're untouchable. There is no capital punishment in Russia, in Europe, and globally in the world. They don't have capital punishment. There is still one in the United States. So I think their mission is to stay unsinkable. And they're actually doing pretty well, let's be frank. They're not impacted by sanctions, and they're not impacted by international warrants. And the same concerns the oligarchs who live in different parts of the world. And even when they're suspected to be in relations with Putin, but nothing happens to them, because the whole world is living in some sort of system of justice. You can't just declare someone a criminal. The person should go through trial, and that's quite expensive, especially when you deal with rich people. And I think that they're okay with this situation. The war that they're waging now, it's clear that they can't conquer Ukraine. It's clear to me. Probably Putin is not clear about that. But I think in Putin's circles there are people who understand that they can't conquer Ukraine, they can't manage that. And even Donbass, they've been in this war since 2014, because the battle for Donbass didn't start in 2022, it started in 2014. And even Donbass, they can't take it over, and they won't be able to. They can keep destroying Ukraine from the air. Yes, you can't really conquer Ukraine like this, and you can't win in a war like that. Historically, human life in Russia costs nothing, so they have human resources to continue the war. Sadly, they have financial resources too, because they have a lot of oil and gas, and oil and gas prices are pretty high, and even with discounts, they still can make money on them. And they will be able to sell gas and oil and other minerals, so they have the money. So, weapons. The Soviet Union was in the second place after America with the weaponry, and Russia is still on the second place with the weapons it has. So if they don't have enough of their weapons, they get weapons from North Korea and China and Iran. So they have weapons, and they can make this war permanent, and this is a problem. So sanctions don't quite work. They of course complicate life for Russians, and it's good they're introduced, but they don't really resolve the issue. That's why they must create the conditions for Russia when within the circle of Putin, because I don't believe actually any negotiations with anybody Putin will go to and sit at the table with those people to negotiate. What's important that in the circles of Putin there will be people who will understand that they actually need to get to the negotiation table and to start talking. And I think that for these people, even for them, there must be an incentive, because so far the war is not a part of their life. This war is waged somewhere far away, and it doesn't impact their life and life of their families. And maybe somebody can find a better method, but I think until Ukraine begins to hit Moscow, and I started talking about it long ago, until Ukraine begins to hit Moscow, and until Moscow feels the war, the leaders of Russia won't have any incentive to finish the war, because Russia is a centralized country and Moscow is the core of it, right? So everybody who lived in Russia and lived in the Soviet Union, they know that the country is huge, but actually it's a country of one city. And beyond Moscow, there is no any life. Of course, I'm not talking about St. Petersburg and Ekaterinburg, big cities. It's kind of separate talk. But in general, this is a country of one city. 90% of all money is in Moscow. 10% of population lives in Moscow. All businesses are in Moscow. All cultural life is in Moscow. And Moscow doesn't feel the war, doesn't feel it at all. The number of billionaires and millionaires in Russia over the years of war increased, and it increases year to year. In fact, for these people, and all of them live in Russia, it turned out that the war is quite profitable, and they are the last people who want the war to end. So, and as a result, we have quite a significant layer of people who are interested in the war, and they're not against this. And those who are against the war, they know that the borders are open. So they left, those who were actively against the war. I don't want to say that everybody who stayed in Russia are pro-war, but the opposition that stayed in Russia can't accumulate the critical mass to fight back. Without guns in their hands, they can't take over the power in Russia. Prigozhin, that mutiny, he didn't have a chance. It's kind of a separate talk, and since I am specialized in special services, secret services, and my version is that Prigozhin was a certain game of FSB against Putin. And I think as a result of that battle, Putin won, and Prigozhin was a recruited agent of FSB, and I can explain it in detail why it is so. So trust me that this is so. And it was a battle for money. It is also so, because a few days before that, before the mutiny, Putin signed an order of transferring Prigozhin's budget, transfer it from FSB to the Ministry of Defense. So there was a conflict of Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense. And in fact, as Putin would have put it, it's the argument of two legal entities. So here we're talking about a few billions of dollars that FSB was supposed to transfer to the Ministry of Defense. And I think the conflict was in this. That's why Prigozhin had no chances to win. And as soon as Patrushev and Putin renegotiated something, nobody needed Prigozhin anymore, and for some reason he decided not to go to Moscow, yet he declared that he's going to Moscow. And then first he was pardoned, and then he was killed. And Patrushev, for some reason, he lost his position, but at the same time, his son kept his position. Maybe they keep his son as a hostage, or maybe it was a price of that bargaining between Patrushev and Putin. Hardly one of them will tell us about it. So in your view, how it's going to end? Soviet Union fell apart. Some people say that it continues falling apart, that this is the conclusion of the end of the Soviet Empire, and now we're witnessing the finale of the play, if I may say so. It's a pretty long finale. Well, that's inevitable. You see, the book that's been published in Latvia, From the Red Terror to the Terrorist State, in Latvian language. The first edition of the book was published in Ukraine in 2021 in Russian and Ukrainian. And together with my co-author, we wrote there that it is stated on the book, it's 1917-2036. And we argued that Putin created a very stable system and he can stay as a president till 2036. And this is the time, the term that he determined for himself back then. And for that, he changed the constitution, and they made the decision by the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation. But there was only one exception, we said there, that if he starts a big war, it will be the end of Putin, the end of the regime of Putin, and the end of the Russian Federation in the shape and form it exists today. And I think in 2022, Putin started this big war that will end him. We don't know when it ends, and of course, we don't know with what it's going to end. But I think the end of this war, no matter when and how, it will entail the further disintegration of Russia. And Putin may think that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe. I think in August of 1991, the Soviet Union didn't finish collapsing. And for Russia to return to the family of the European countries and to become a normal country and a part of Europe, first, Russia needs to stop being an empire, because the Russian Federation today is still an empire. It's not as Soviet Union, but nevertheless it's under-collapsed Soviet Union. That's the first thing. And for Russia to stop being an empire, it's not supposed just to lose certain territories or let some republics go, like Chechnya, Tatarstan, and others. That's why I would like to emphasize, I don't suppose, and I'm not the supporter of this version, that Russia will fall apart into many states. So there will be like Voronezh state, Bryansky state. No. In fact, in history, we don't have such examples, and I don't think that this is something that Russia may experience. But I think some ethnic republics may separate from Russia. But the main thing is that Russia should stop and see itself as empire mentally. It's a very complicated philosophical conversation. But I think that this is why Russia creates all these problems for itself. And until Russia stops thinking as empire and seeing itself as empire and sincerely thinking that there is a great Russian people and there are some other nations, I think we won't be able to help Russia in any way. And the last point is when. Again, I emphasize I don't know when the current war ends. I think probably no one knows. People may assume, but nobody knows. But this is what I think we do know, based on the experience of Germany of World War II, that after the date of the end of the war, we need to count approximately 80 years when Russia could be forgiven for the war. And that's the point, and this is the complexity that no one keeps in mind. So it's several generations. Yes, it's not just several generations. As Germany's experience shows us, the new Chancellor of Germany, Merz, said his famous words, "Germany is back," and everybody in Europe applauded this phrase. And there are 2 points here. First of all, only Putin could achieve such a result, that the statement of the German Chancellor that Germany is getting armed would cause such a cheer. And only Putin could achieve such a result that Sweden and Finland join NATO. But the second point is that 80 years passed, which means all those people, all of them who lived in that time, in that historical time, very short time from 1932 to 1945, all of them died. 80 years. So that's why I don't know when the war ends, but from that date when it ends, we need to count 80 years. This is the period of time that will be needed for Russia to be forgiven for the crimes it committed for these years, from 2014 to whatever the date will be. And there are two Chechen wars also, so 80 years. And this is what Russia will have to go through. And it'll take a long, long time after the end of the war. Just like Germany. Russia has to lose, then there should be a Nuremberg tribunal, because, you know, Germans, they didn't confess themselves, so they were forced to confess. Yes, right, and that's the problem. For this to happen in Germany, Germany had to lose, and the scale of this loss must be like World War II. And of course, if Russia will be defeated like Germany back in 1945, but for this war has to become the Third World War. But all of us don't want this. And that's the difficulty here. As a permanent war, it can go on endlessly. But these 80 years, that'll start only on the date of the end of the war. And let's be frank, none of us will be around for that. The fact that it's not going to happen sooner, I'm convinced it won't. That's why when they're discussing this matter of beautiful Russia of the future, I'm very skeptical about this, because it doesn't have to do with Putin's leaving. And I think when he leaves, the situation will be only better. But what I'm saying, the forgiveness that Russia will have to receive, it has nothing to do with Putin's departure. I think it has to do more with the human memory that is structured differently. Okay, we will follow the events, and thank you very much for being with us and finding the time to be with us. Thank you. See you soon. Bye.